In this episode, we're going to consider two more characters with special connections to Preservation Inlet. The first is another man who spent years living in harsh conditions in the New Zealand bush trying to make his fortune. His name is Andreas Reischek, and in his case, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow was not minerals, but native birds. And unlike William Doherty from our last episode, who never did anyone any harm and was widely respected, Reischek has earned historic infamy for stealing human remains from Maori burial caves at Kawhia in the King Country and sending them to a museum in Austria. Fortunately, those remains, after a century or more in Vienna, have now been returned to New Zealand. So perhaps we can put aside that great black mark against Reischek and consider instead his special connection to Preservation Inlet, a place that he spent 5 long months in 1887 in his quest to find examples of rare native birds to add to his collection. The first time, in 1884, he passed through here en route to Dusky Sound, where he borrowed William Doherty's hut and spent a tough few months there, plagued by sandflies and frustrated by the never-ending rain. He also injured himself badly with an axe, was caught on the mountaintops in a snowstorm, nearly drowned, and endured food poisoning. All that kept him alive was the ministrations of his faithful dog, Caesar. And on the boat journey out, he lost the kakapo he had caught, ruining the whole expedition. Nonetheless, 3 years later, in 1887, Reischek came south again in a last-ditch attempt to find Taki, that great prize for 19th century ornithologists. This time he stayed for 5 months and he had a human companion as well as the faithful Caesar.
This location where Reischek and Rimmer lived for 5 months is stunningly beautiful. The bush is thick and lush. It has, however, been decimated by pests. There's almost no bird song here. Reischek, when he was actually here, was recording plague numbers of rats, and they worked extremely hard to eradicate them around the campsite and around the site. And he notes that he expects the bird life to do very poorly in this area because of the numbers of rats. The sandflies here as well drove them absolutely bonkers. We haven't been here that long yet, so I don't think we've been driven to that level of insanity.
They set up camp here in Fishmans Bay in Northport. And of course it started pouring with rain the moment they arrived and didn't let up for 3 weeks. But undaunted, they built themselves a hut, cleared half an acre of bush for a garden, and then spent the next 5 months exploring the surrounding area. And archaeologists think that this hut site here was probably Reischek's.
Well, it's pretty obvious that this was cleared about 150 years ago. And if you look carefully, there are a couple of rows of stones, which must have been the foundations. We've got a corner here and a bigger empty area where that stump is now, where the hearth used to be. And that matches with the records from 1978 when Neville Ritchie visited it. It is relatively well preserved because it's so remote, because nobody else comes here in Fossex. And and the lack of growth makes it relatively easy to find. Yeah.
There are a couple of tracks here that owe their origins to Reischek's efforts back in 1887. This one leads along the north shore of Chalky Inlet to Landing Bay, and there's another one that goes up onto the heights where Reischek actually discovered a couple of small lakes, one of which he named after his faithful dog Caesar. But his main effort, of course, was the search for rare birds. Takahe eluded him, but he eventually collected examples of 42 different species here, including distinctive native birds like kakapo, kiwi, and kōkako that soon after disappeared from this area. But more importantly, he could see that rats and the mustard stoats and weasels that were already wreaking havoc here spelled doom for many of the magnificent ground-dwelling birds that were unique to New Zealand. Ironically, that was exactly why he was killing and stuffing them, so that some examples would survive for scientific study once all the live ones were gone. And in that at least, the Austrian was successful. When he left New Zealand for good in 1889, he took with him one of the most complete collections of New Zealand birds ever assembled. He expected to sell it for millions to the great museums of Europe. But the humble taxidermist didn't have the contacts to engineer such a sale. In the event, he settled for a much more modest sum.
Andreas Reischek is a complex character in the natural history world. From an ornithology perspective, he was a dedicated scientist who made astute observations, described a number of new species in New Zealand, collected specimens which are the only records of some birds in these rugged locations. From a social point of view, he was a much more complex character. He was clearly charismatic, but also was prone to collecting ethnographic materials in a very dubious way, such as grave robbing. So from all of that natural science perspective, he was also getting himself into a lot of mischief by leading other people in New Zealand along to trust him, and then abusing that trust by getting into very tapu areas.
Reischek retired to life in his hometown, working in the small museum there until he died in 1902, aged 56. His birds remain in Austria at the State History Museum in Vienna. They are part of the most significant collection of New Zealand flora and fauna outside of this country. Our next character from these parts is also foreign-born, but this time he's a Swede rather than an Austrian. He was born as Carl Axel Björk in Stockholm in 1880, but by the time he washed up here in Preservation Inlet in the 1920s, his name had morphed into Jules Berg, and it's by that moniker that he is remembered here in the south. Jules was orphaned early in life and went to sea as a young man, travelling all around the world before arriving in New Zealand around 1909. He worked for a time as a whaler on Stewart Island, but eventually found his way to Preservation Inlet and fell in love. It wasn't a woman who stole his heart, rather it was the lonesome beauty of this bush-clad inlet. He started working here as a roadman on the supply track to the Pusica Point Lighthouse. Then he moved here to Te Oniroa, where he built himself a primitive hut and supported himself by prospecting for gold. Now, this was long after all the big mining enterprises had petered out, but there was still enough gold around to support a man who had simple tastes and few material needs. And those were qualities that really defined Jules Berg. He was happy living off whatever he could grow or catch or kill. He made his own wine, hundreds of gallons of it each year from the parsnips and carrots he grew in his bush garden. And he was more than happy to share it with his many visitors, especially the Furthest Strait fishermen who spent long evenings by his fire, sipping his wicked concoctions and swapping stories with the hospitable little miner. In time, he became a beloved figure whose idiosyncrasies were treasured by all who knew him. Stories about Jules Berg are legion. Like, for instance, the way he dealt with the sandfly problem with a daub of rancid butter mixed with Jay's fluid, which he stuck to his hat, and then he'd dip his finger into this noxious mixture and smear it all over his face. Or the alarm system he had rigged up in his garden for intruding deer, for instance, that would ignite a battery-operated spotlight, and then Jules would open a trapdoor on the side of his hut, poke his rifle out and let rip. Eventually, of course, old age caught up with Jules and his friends took him to Invercargill for medical attention. Returning to his bush home was not an option, and he ended up living in a small cottage in Riverton for his final months. He died in Riverton Hospital in 1952, aged 72. Sadly, this legend of Preservation Inlet now lies here in Riverton Cemetery in an unmarked grave. There are no formal memorials to Jules Berg, but his legend lives on here in Preservation Inlet. One of the folk heroes of simpler times, a man who asked little of the world, but gave much.